Hello and welcome to another Saint Toga interview. We have Daryl back, and he has new recollections, and it's good timing as well with recent videos that I've published related to the history of Egypt and the old gods, as well as Aquino, and the fact that the whole subject of ufology is finally gaining momentum. So first, let's maybe set it up. I believe that the recall has to do with the incident where you were tortured for 2 days in the caverns of Cornwall.
Yes, it has to do with that, but it also has to do exactly with what my executive officer, Robert, had to tell me about to try to make sense of it all. Like none of it made sense to me what he was telling me. So he was a good salesman and he was intelligent, so he knew how to explain things to you, to so you would believe him, so you would understand.
Okay. Do you believe that this new flood of memories might have anything to do with your time loop self coming back? Because I know that that's just around the corner.
I believe that's going to happen around June 9th. I've kind of like pinpointed it. He said it would happen right after my birthday. My birthday was June 6th. I don't remember the exact date that he gave me, but he said it would happen right after my birthday when I would remember the rest of this, I guess you would say.
Right. What exactly triggered this, if I may ask, this new recall?
Um, I was in the hospital with my mother a few years back, and she got the vaccine. She got all the boosters. My sister had power of attorney over her, and my sister believed everything. She watched the news every day, and she believed all these things. And she got the vaccine, and she got all of the boosters with it as well. And she got cancer, and I was sitting down next to her at the hospital, and I saw in the morning news Paul Rubin died, who was Pee Wee Herman when I was a kid. It was a television show we watched when we were kids. And I remembered when I was talking to Robert that, well, I'll explain it like this. He was telling me things like, he told me I had all these children, that I was the king of some other people, and I wasn't believing anything he said, and it was just like too much to believe. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, he said, "I saw your father." And I said, "How did you see my father? He's been dead for years." And he said, "Through the looking glass." And I said, "What's the looking glass?" And he explained to me it was like a portal where you could put on a visor, and it basically just looked like shimmering white, almost like shimmering water. He kind of explained it to me. It looked similar to Stargate, from the movie Stargate. It would look like shimmering, but it was like white, and you couldn't really see the interference, I guess you would say, the visual interference. And when you put this headset on, it cleared up all the visual interference, and you could just see through the looking glass. You didn't have to step through, so that's where they get the term from, like Alice in Wonderland, through the looking glass. You can either observe or you could step through. And this out of the blue, when he said he saw my father, I didn't believe that either. And he said he wore glasses, and he would roll the sleeves up on his shirt, and he kept a pack of Camel cigarettes in the sleeve, and he wore jeans and boots, and he was a mechanic, and he used to race cars, and he moved to St. Petersburg, Florida in 1955, but I didn't observe him until 1956 when he was established. And he was saying things like, he got a new job every 3 or 4 months. And I said, well, he already had kids by then from his first wife. I said, was it very, it doesn't seem like a smart thing to, have a job every 3 or 4 months. He said it was the mid 50s and the United States in a growing city, the strongest economy we ever had. He said everybody got a new job every 3 or 4 months, unless you were like like a manager, you had a degree, you pretty much just went from job to job, and you had enough money to support a wife and 6 kids on your own. And yeah, so he told me that, and it cleared up things up for me. I started to believe him. I started thinking, like, I really didn't know what to think, because he was doing a combination of telling me what he saw in the looking glass, looking down my timeline. He told me he was from the year 2580. He was genetically augmented in the womb. and all these other things. And yeah, and he said he had the ability to, like, you know, be able to look down timelines and see people's future. And so I kind of thought he was almost like demigod. Like, I really didn't know what to think. I didn't have any of my memories back yet. He was telling me things only I would know to get my confidence. I really didn't know what a looking glass was. I just thought he just kind of like knew things, and and at the same time he did know things. He knew how to go down timelines. He knew how to see people's futures and things like that, because time is an illusion. And he was explaining this to me. And by 2580, Earth was already fifth density. And, you know, so he was like a fifth density being, and he had to wear technology like a belt
Yeah.
to kind of keep him, you know, so he wasn't just like a blur of light when he moved around in third density, is how he explained it. He would otherwise he would look like a blur of light. And it scared me. I didn't like someone knowing my future. I didn't like this, you know, and it kind of freaked me out. And immediately I said, "Don't tell me when my mother dies." I was like, "You could tell me anything else. You could tell me when I die, but don't tell me when my mother dies." And he kind of looked around and he looked right at me and he said, "Your mother dies 3 days after Paul Rubin."
Oh,
And I said, "Pee Wee Herman?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "How do you know this?" And he said, "Because you're sitting down in a chair in the hospital next to her and you're watching the morning news and you see that Paul Rubin dies." And I said, "Why did you tell me this?" He said, "It doesn't matter. You're not going to remember until it happens." And he was right. It was just something I kind of blocked out, and I didn't remember until it actually happened. Until that event happened to me. And as that happened, I just started. It kind of unlocked like another chapter of what he told me, like different things he told me. And when we were in the office before I was processing out of the Navy, he was telling me about Aquino. And this is like scary stuff. I don't know. Like, the way he explained it, it's kind of like we were talking about Aquino for a long time. And he said we should stop talking about him. And I said, "Why?" And he said, Aquino's lower fourth density. And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, like, astral plane, spirit world. And I said, "Well, you know," and he explained like reptiles and archons. And I said, "What's an archon?" And he said, "Evil spirits is," and I said, "Those things exist?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, if he's lower fourth, then what's, you know, upper fourth? What's higher fourth?" And he said, "Elves, fairies, gnomes." And I kind of looked at him like sarcastically, and I said, "You know, wood nymphs?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Thistlefinks?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Are they evil?" And he said, "Well, they're mischievous." He's like, "They're really not evil." He's like, "Lower fourth is more like negative, but, you know, upper fourth is just, I don't know. They just like to screw around your life for entertainment kind of thing." I guess is how he explained it. And yeah, so he started going on about Aquino. And if you don't know who Michael Aquino is, I actually watched the documentary on him. And this was on Rumble. And this wasn't a Rumble documentary. This was a mainstream TV um like a
reposted. Yeah.
documentary. Yeah, about a year probably after the Presidio case, which is a case that happened in San Diego, California, I believe. It was an army base. And I think it was around 36 children claimed you know, pedophilia against Michael Aquino. And he's always said it was like an admiral's daughter or some officer's daughter that was trying to blackmail him for money or something like that, some nonsense. That's what Aquino said it was about. But according to this documentary that was on, like, you know, ABC, CBS, and like one of the main street, like main television channels, um, it was 36 children, and they said that they were taken to the basement of the daycare center, led through a tunnel, climbed up another ladder in another basement, and then they were in Aquino's house, and they uncovered this tunnel that he had dug. You know, they found stucco, like fresh stucco on a wall of the basement. They found fresh stucco on his house on base. You know, so it was pretty close. He had a house on the army base. And yeah, they found this tunnel and they found skeletal remains of a child. And I think back then they couldn't determine, sex. If they didn't find, the ribs, all the ribs and stuff like that, they couldn't. They had kind of DNA, but not like we have now. So they couldn't determine the sex of the child, but they found a child's remains, like partial skeletal remains. And yeah, he just got away with it. You know what I mean? It was just buried. And I asked Robert about this in the office, and I said, "Well, how did he get away with this?" And he said, the judge was a Satanist. The prosecutor and defense lawyers were both Satanists. The daycare workers were Satanists. Like they were all in on it. And I would have never believed anything like this until I was on this base and I realized that like how many people were actually in on, these terrible things that involved, harvesting of children for their blood and stuff like that. And that happened in the caverns below this underground base. And so I remembered a reptile. It was just like I was trying to kind of recalling stuff as he was telling me things. I was getting more memories. It was almost one of those things where it was like, how did I ever forget that? Like he told me one of the first technologies you're going to see is the smartphone, and it's based off the smart glass pad. And I said, what's a smart glass pad? And all he would say was the smart glass pad, you remember. And when he said, you remember, it was just like floods of memory came back to me of me like holding the like this pad, this clear pad that was almost like a smartphone, like a computer, but it was clear. And, you could pull holograms out of it. You could put your hand on it, pull it up, open it up, spin things around, things like that. And, and I said, this is me back in the office talking to him. And I said, I remember there was some sort of reptile, like a black reptile that wore like a red hood and a red robe. I said, what was this? Like, what was that reptile? And like, this is the part where it's like, you kind of have to be careful. And I've gone back and I saw this firsthand work. And I've gone back to Christianity. And you might want to, I don't know, pray or clear or something like that if you're listening to this interview, because it's like he was very like worried about even saying the name. And I said, like, well, what was this reptile? And he said, Sobeck. And I said, who's Sobeck? And he said, ancient Egyptian god of fertility, guardian of the Nile. Do you have something to say?
That's just amazing because Sobek is the actual subject of the last audiobook that I posted. So yeah, it's very much on point. So yeah, continue.
Well, synchronicities, I picked the right guy. So yeah, and I was like, what the hell is an ancient Egyptian reptilian god doing in like Cornwall, in the caverns of Cornwall? And he explained to me that the earth is honeycombed deep within the earth, but it's deep within the earth. But there's cities, it's completely honeycombed, the whole, mantle, outer core, inner core, like that's all nonsense. He said there's like an inner sun within the earth, it's honeycombed, there's cities. He said I had been to the inner earth, but I really don't remember that. Like I'm honestly, I don't remember that. But he said, you've been to the inner earth, don't you remember that? And I still don't really remember those memories. But he said because of the cliffs of Cornwall, which is in England, and there's like big sheer cliffs. It's like a peninsula that is right below south of Wales. And because of these sheer granite and cliffs, waves have been crashing against them for millions and millions of years, and it's created a complex cave system like all throughout like the peninsula of Cornwall. And so that these beings that live deep within the earth are actually much closer to the surface because of all these caverns in Cornwall. They actually live in all these caverns. And they're just like a naturally occurring thing within the earth. This because of the waves. I don't know, maybe it's because of lava or magma that creates all this complex cave system deep within the earth. But the reptiles and the beings that live in these caverns within the earth are much closer to the surface. And all underground bases belong to the reptiles, he told me. We got into a war a long time ago with them. We had outside help. The war became a stalemate. And the agreement of the stalemate was that we get the above ground and they get the underground. And I said, well, it sounds like we got the better end of the deal. And he said, not really. And I said, why? He said, there's more real estate within the earth. There's actually more real estate than on the surface.
Because it's multi-leveled.
Yes, yes. And yeah, and he was explaining this to me, and he said that, and then he went into Egypt. He said Egypt is more like 10,000 BC instead of 3150, which I think is like what they think Egypt started was 3150 according to
Yeah, they're
history.
starting to admit that it's more than that. But yeah, I think it coincides with the fall of Atlantis, right? The cataclysm there. That's the
Yes, yes,
timing of the Giza complex being built.
I would say so. And he said in the beginning, the avians came, like Thoth and Ra, and that was 10,000 BC. And they actually built the Great Pyramids. And nowadays, the pillars below that everybody's talking about, the Great Pyramids. And I brought this up at a conference. It was the second Journey to Truth conference. And somebody asked, like, one of the audience members asked, you know, how do ETs get their power for their world? Do they get it from the ether? And nobody answered. And I said they get it from the magnetic field of their world. And that's what I remembered. That's how they get their power. So what those pillars are below the pyramid is a power source collecting off the magnetic field of Earth itself. And that's what he explained to me what those were. And he said they were once covered in sheets of gold.
The
And
pyramids.
the Great Pyramids were once covered in sheets of
Hmm.
gold. Because it's a good conductor. And he said that they were used for a means of communicating with their home world, the avians, a way of creating power, and also portals to go to their home world. And he said the power was given to the obelisk, which was once covered in sheets of gold, and that worked like a Tesla tower, like wireless energy. And they felt like the Egyptian people were too primitive because they were still a Bronze Age people. But just to be reciprocal, like in the sense of we're going to take some of your land, but in exchange, we're going to give you free power. All they really had was this like free power, like lights and a way to like heat their homes and things like that. But they were still basically just a Bronze Age people. And the avians just let them to their own devices and really didn't interfere. It was just a way to be like positive ETs, they're more reciprocal. If we're going to take something from you, we'll give something back. It was just that was like their theory. And I said, so they had feathered bodies. And he said they looked just like the statues. They looked just like the paintings. And I said, so they had feathered heads, but like flesh bodies like us. And he said, no, the flesh bodies represented they're flesh and blood like us. They're mortal. Like that's what he said they would have had feathered bodies, but the flesh represented to the Egyptian people that, they're flesh and blood like us and they're mortal. And then he said around 7,500 is when the canines and the felines came. And he was just giving me military terms of what they call these beings. I think they call what the felines, you would know this.
Yeah, Sekhmet, I think, is a goddess. There are multiple felines, I guess. Lyrans are what they're usually called.
Lyrans, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah,
Okay.
and the canines. And yeah, and he said they came around 7,500 and they were at peace. And they worked with the avians and they were at peace and they continued on with peace. And it wasn't until I think around 3150 when supposed real Egyptian history happens is when the reptiles came. And they went to war, they declared war on them and basically drove them off Earth. And they took over Egypt after that. And all the other history was shattered. And so Sobek was one of those originals around. He said he was over 5,000 years old. And so what he told me was since the Egyptian people were still a Bronze Age people, and the number one export from Cornwall to this day is tin. They have a lot of tin mining. And Cornwall would have been where the capital city was of Britain back then in those days. That's where their capital city would be because it was the main like trading hub. And that was like their main export for ancient Egypt back in those days. So, you need tin to mix with copper to create bronze. Like that's what creates bronze. So they were still a Bronze Age people. So that's where they got all their tin. So that's how he explained to me that that's how this 5,000-year-old reptile was living, in Cornwall, in the caverns of Cornwall, because this was a main trading hub for ancient Egypt long ago.
Hmm. So when you said Sobek, you're referring to the same humanoid that looked like, I think you said Black Racer, snakehead in a red robe.
He could change and shift It was a fourth density. It was bizarre. Sometimes he would look more snake-like, and other times he would look more crocodile-like. It was like he was trying to hide his identity from me, almost. And I remember when I was in the cavern, he was in front of a table where he kept like, his torture kind of tools, knives and scrapers, the things he was torturing me with. And he looked over at me, and I was just looking at him. And then all of a sudden he disappeared. And I looked down to the left, and he was just like looking at me down to the left. And then he disappeared again. And then he was in the back room to the left. And I could see him again, and he walked towards me. And the goon at the bar, which was like a Satanist that I didn't really know at the time, who used to drink at the bar on base, he explained to me that he said, when you're taking acid, have you ever taken acid before? And I said, I've taken mushrooms. And he goes, well, mushrooms the same thing. He's like, those waves you feel coming down? They feel like they're coming down from the universe, and you just feel wave after wave after wave. And I said, yeah, I used to call those echoes. And he goes, echoes, that's a good word for it. He said, well, they live between the echoes. He said, you can see between the echoes. So Aquino went back in time and destroyed your childhood, so you couldn't see between the echoes anymore. And that's how he explained it to me. So whatever he was doing, and Robert even told me, he's like, we should stop talking about him now. He said that. And I said, why? He said, we can conjure him. He said he could be in this room right now. We wouldn't be able to see him. He said, I have a better chance than you because I'm fifth density. He said, you're only partially in fifth. I'd have a better chance of seeing it than you. And as he went further down my timeline, he said like you could see him, and he was just like, you had the ability, and you knew that phrase echoes. You knew that was a memory of mine in the future of having this discussion with this Satanist in the bar, and he said like that's why you could see him, and that's why he like went back in time and destroyed your childhood, and that was like very horrible. I remember that happening like in the midst of it, I guess you would say, like hanging on a torture rack, him realizing I could see his tricks. As I said in the beginning, I saw the reptilian shapeshifter thing, that David Icke talks about and everything else, where it was this reptile, this black reptile in front of me all of a sudden. And he said, like, don't you remember me, Daryl? And I didn't know what was happening. I had like this temporary amnesia that you go through when you get pushed into different densities. You don't know what's happening. You're all out of whack. And all of a sudden I saw these two images being blended together. And it was all of a sudden I saw like Aquino in front of me. And he said, now do you remember me? And when I saw this, off to my left, I saw this little shadowy figure kind of scurrying back, like into the shadows in the back of the room. And I just looked over, the meat puppet is what I call Aquino. I looked over his shoulder, and I looked at the reptile doing this, and I said, nice trick. And I didn't know what I was doing, but I saw it, you know what I mean? And he stepped out of the shadows, and he said, well, most people, it works on most, he said. So when he realized that I could see whatever this teleportation kind of, maybe he was going from portal to portal and kind of hopping around the room to see if I could see him every time, and I could. Whatever this was, it took about 8 hours, and he was slowly like going back in time in my timeline and like destroying it. And when I was young, when I was in the office with Robert, he said, Aquino could have done something to you. And I said, what? He said, he could have put attachments on you. And I said, what's attachments? And he said, archons. And I said, what's an archon? And he like shrugged his shoulders and he said, evil spirits. And I said, those things exist? And he said, yes. And then he was just going down my timeline, and he realized I would remember. I remembered on the full moon of December, the 15th of December last year. This is when this revelation really came into, full recognition of what was happening. And he was going down my timeline. He looked at me very shocked, and he said, Daryl, this is bad. This is really bad. And I said, what's happening? And he said, it's not an archon. And I said, what? He said, it's him. It's him. And I said, what do you mean? He said, Aquino's controlling you. I said, like, what are you saying? And I picked the pen up off his desk and I said, did he control me to do this? And he said, no. And then I put it down and I said, well, I can handle it. He's like, Daryl, you don't know how bad this is. He said, if you get into the chair right now, I can remove him. The chair can remove him. You have to go back into the chair. He kept on saying that. That was very like important to him. You have to get back into the chair.
Meaning if you went in another 20 and back or what?
No, just the chair. The chair can do something. I don't know. It can remove stuff.
The density chair.
That was a density chamber chair. He called it the chair. Yeah, it did more than just, I guess, push you up into a higher density. Because when I was talking to a first-class petty officer who first introduced me to the program, he said to me, when he was looking at the computer and he's looking at my IQ, he's looking at, he knew different things about me, like I smoked and I drank and I didn't have any clots in my body and things like that. And he said, it looks like you have somebody else living in there with you.
Whoa.
And yeah, that's what he said. And he said, don't worry, we'll get that out. Like, it was just like no big deal for him. He was like, oh, we'll get that out for you. But yeah, like Robert explained to me, and he said, it looks like you have somebody else living in there. And he said, were you molested as a kid? And I said, yes. And he said, well, that explains it. Like that's why it's there. He's like, we'll get that out for you. And then Robert explained to me, he said that, you were molested when you were 7. And that's when he entered you. And that's like when it happened. And he said, and you're not going to get rid of him until 47. He said he's going to be with you until you're 47. He's like, but I can stop it. I can stop it now. He's like, I can get rid of it. And I said, well, will you allow me to keep my memories? And he said, no, I can't do that. And I said, well, I don't want to do it. And, I just didn't trust him. I just didn't like him. He got me into this situation to begin with. Yeah. And I'm like 47, I'm 47 now. And it was around, December 15th. I remember being in the caverns with the reptile. I'll just call him that for now. And because if you say his name too much, Robert kind of had this whole conjuring thing. He was afraid that, if we said his name too many times, we could conjure him.
Could we maybe delineate between where Aquino begins and Sobek ends? I mean, sorry, because he himself was possessed, right, from an early age.
Yeah. There was a guy named Orlando that worked in the underground base. I just worked in the garage off the base. I went in there one time to escort some civilian workers from Siemens, and I walked through this scanner. It looked like a metal detector you'd see at an airport or something. And that's how I got my IQ and clots and drinking and smoking and everything else. But this guy Orlando would come up to me and he'd just start talking to him. And also the command, I found out later from Robert in the office, because I asked him, I said, were people like watching me and asking me questions to see if I remembered this? And he said, yes. And it seemed like there was like a group of people who turned the program down. And they were like the spies of the people who joined the program. So they were like told, like, ask these guys questions, see if they remember anything, make sure they don't remember anything, things like that. And he said somebody else in the underground base told him that there's a machine that can extract a soul from a body, but they have to do it before puberty for some reason. But they can't do it when they're too young because the body's mostly sedentary. It's mostly just sitting down waiting to be possessed by this other consciousness, and then it's used like a vehicle, just as that we are as well. You know what I mean? Like the off-world Germans used to call us meat sacks because that's pretty much what our flesh is. It's like that's not us. We're a soul, a consciousness. Those are real, and this is just whatever. Yeah, a matrix, whatever you want to call it. I don't really know, but I can't figure it out myself. But it's just, and he said that that's what happened to Aquino. He had his soul extracted when he was around 9 or 10 years old, right before puberty, and something else is inhabiting his body. And I said, well, what's inhabiting him? He said, I don't know. He didn't know. And then he also brought up how he said, you know, after the Presidio case, because this guy Orlando, he had like a Patton poster on the wall, like General Patton. He had like SS, like little toy soldiers and Panzer tanks and Tiger tanks, and he made all these models. And I didn't understand this. Orlando, his grandparents were from Mexico, and I was like, why does this guy who's Mexican have all this like Nazi stuff in his room? You know what I mean? He had all like these stuff. And I remember one time a chief with a mustache that was skinny, wore glasses. He was an off-world German. That's what Robert called them. We were playing video games in his room one time, like in the barracks, and we just had the door open, and this chief came in, and he knew like all the official like names to everything, the planes, the German tanks. He was like, "Oh, that's the P-1893." You know what I mean? Like he knew all this stuff, and I was like, "How does this guy know all? Like, how does this chief just randomly know like the official military names of all these vehicles that he had models of?" But anyways, going back to him explaining to me, there's a machine extracting the soul of Aquino, and something else is inhabiting the body. He said that after the Presidio case, he was forced to go into the reserves, the Army reserves. And he's like, like 1 week in a month, 2 weeks out of the year. And I said, yeah, like I know what the reserves are. He's like, so he shouldn't be on an underground base. Like he said that, like he shouldn't be here. He's a reservist. And he said he should have retired last year, but he's still here and he's still wearing his uniform. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And it all goes to, as Robert told me later on, it's like they own every underground base in the world because they own the underground. That was like the treaty of the stalemate of the war we got in with them. And we had outside help, as I was explaining. We had like other ETs helped us in this war. But yeah, so every underground, it doesn't matter where it's at. If it's in the United States, if it's in England or wherever it's at, it always belongs to the reptiles. And yeah, I mean, when I was in the cavern with the reptile, the black reptile,
Mhm.
he was going back. He saw I could do this. He saw I could see his tricks. He saw I could do that. He knew I could do this. He didn't want me to be able to do it anymore. So 7 years old, when at the time, whenever, I was molested as a kid, he started from there and he continued on and to 47. And I could feel it. It was really weird. I was like hanging on a torture rack and I could feel like my timeline being changed. And it was like, I learned from the Taigetans, the Pleiadians, Nordics, that kind of how to combat this stuff. I'd been given training through elders, mother helped me like train and things like that. And I was trying to fight it at first, but I'd already been tortured for like a day by now, and I was very exhausted, and I just couldn't put up a fight anymore, and I couldn't like stop it. And I could just feel like it wasn't like I recalled my original past because that never happened because it was altered in my timeline because of him. But it was like kind of like I could just feel like becoming heavier, like my burden in life or whatever you want to call it, becoming heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier. And Robert also explained to me that all ETs can go forward in timelines, but only like the ones that are around 2,000 years and above can actually go back in time on your timeline and alter your timeline. So Robert had the ability to go forward. He couldn't really influence me, he said. He said it was almost like a possession when somebody went down your timeline. It was kind of like you were riding in someone else's body just along for the ride. And you could just, you could fast
Piggyback.
forward to the more mundane. I'm sorry.
Piggyback.
Yeah. It was kind of like he was, and you could step outside the person's, you could kind of go outside the person's body and look around and can branch off into other people's timelines. He could do that as well. So people that I've met in life, you know what I mean? He had the ability to like go down their timeline really quick and then come back to me. And that's what he called it. He called it branching off into other timelines. And so yeah, I could feel this as it was happening. It was just like my life was getting like more burdensome and difficult, and I could feel that, and it was like hard, and it was almost like spiritually painful. And he was just influencing all these different people in my timeline to do wrong to me, to do bad to me. You know what I mean? He was just like, and I mean, I even asked Robert, was it like a possession? And he's like, no, it's not really like a possession like you think of it. It's just like if you do things like drugs, if you do things like I wouldn't say pot, but alcohol,
Vices.
cocaine, vices, yeah, steroids, stuff that like affects you mentally, makes you more angry, can upset you, things like that. He had a better chance of getting in and then influencing me at that point in time. You know what I mean? So that's more like what it was. It wasn't like an actual possession. It was just like he'd wait for weak points in my life and then he could get in, or he could kind of like, you know, have someone who was drunk or something like that, assault me or something, beat me up. That's happened before to me and things like that. And so when people are like a weak point, when they have certain bad vices, it's easier for things like, and even Aleister Crowley talks about this. If you want to get if you want to get possessed or, stuff like that, alcohol and drugs are like the best way of doing it. I don't know why you'd want to be, but yeah, like even Aleister Crowley talked about things like that. But yeah, yeah, and it was just eventually he stopped and he piggybacked off me onto someone else to try to weave someone into my timeline to kind of you know one last Hail Mary, as they say in American football, where you throw a long pass and it might make it, it might not. And it didn't work, but he weaved someone else into my timeline, and now Sobeck is that person's problem. But yeah,
Al-
he did this, huh?
Although I take it that he can inhabit multiple people at once, right? Because, and it's safe to say that Aquino was his victim in particular, because that's why when you said in prior interviews that Aquino managed to go back your timeline, it actually means this entity, because only this entity is over 2,000 years old.
Yeah, he was over 5,000. Yeah, so over 2,000, he could definitely do it. Yeah. But yeah, and because time is an illusion, he kept on trying to tell me that. Like, so he could just go down someone else's timeline, rewind, go down to someone else's timeline, rewind, go down to, you know what I mean? He could do this. And he was just basically feeding off my Luch. You know what I mean? My pain, my suffering, all the things that he caused to me, things like that, all this stuff. And he was like getting a high off of this, if that makes sense. And yeah, he did this, and then he got to a point where he said, "I've lost control over you." And he said, "But before I do, I'm going to leave my mark right here." And he like hit me in the head. And then last year, December 15th, I felt like a constant tingle, like right about there, right in the middle of the timeline, or right in the middle of the hairline. And for 5 days, I felt this tingle for five, like a very, very strong tingle. And then that brought me back to this memory. And then that's how I recalled that memory, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And when you said that the EXO seemed like a demigod when he first saying that to you, is because you had just been mind wiped.
I mean, I had been mind wiped almost 2 years because I still had 2 years in the command. And I joined the program, shoot, the first 3 weeks, I would say, when I first got to this command. So yeah, and that's what all the weird events happened to me with, the Satanist in the bar knowing things about me. They knew all kinds of things about me that they shouldn't have known. And this one Satanist would just keep on saying, like, Aquino wanted me to let you know that. Like, he just wanted me to let you know that. Like, I don't know if he was still conversing with him in the caverns or something like that. But yeah, I mean, uh, this happened, and yeah, I mean, that was the end. I went through a kind of Stockholm syndrome, which sounds weird. Like, I went into kind of a deep depression for several months because I realized that this was over, but at the same time, it was almost like, just like when somebody is a slave or, being abused by someone, they like their abuser, they get to like accustomed to that and they seem to like, and yeah, I went through like a kind of Stockholm syndrome for several months. And a big part of it, I think, is what helped me was, yeah, you know, Christianity, like, you know what I mean? I remember whenever Sobek was torturing me, just out of desperation, I was in a lot of pain. I said, "What in the name of Christ do you want?" And he said, "Stop it. Stop saying that." Like he said that. And then I just kind of added it together, and I said, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to undo my straps and take me out of here. And he started undoing my straps on this torture rack. And then he was kind of like talking out of the side of his mouth to the goon, the Satanist that was all with the shaved head that was always there. And I said, in the name of Yeshua, I command you to stop talking to him. And then he stopped. But the goon was wise to it by then, and he was, just a human, a Satanist. He just cocked back and knocked me out, hit me right in the chin and knocked me out. And I was hurt badly for that. He didn't like that at all. But yeah.
And you mentioned Yeshua, he actually studied the ascension rites in Giza as well.
Oh, may I say something?
Yeah, sure.
I asked Robert just out of curiosity, because I really had maybe I had a faint memory in the back of my head of saying that. And Robert used this looking glass. He claimed, I think he said he walked ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome.
Meaning he actually physically went, not just watched, but actually was immersed in it?
Yeah, like he would wear like the traditional, outfits, fashion that those people wore at the time, and he would just walk around. He said he'd walk in all these ancient cultures of long ago, and he'd
Atlantis?
actually. I don't know about Atlantis, but he said Atlantis was real.
Mm-hmm.
He said that before Caesar burned down the Library of Alexandria, that everything was actually confiscated, and it's all in the catacombs of the Vatican, and that's supposed to be eventually released. And history's a lie, medicine's a lie, everything's a lie, and it's all going to be released sometime. I believe within my lifetime. I hope. But oh well, I said he had this looking glass, and I said, was Jesus real? And he said yes, and his name holds power. And he explained to me that he was basically like a higher density being. And
you know what lineage?
I don't remember. I don't remember. But they say that in the programs and stuff, like these military officers, they call it density, but it's the same thing as like spiritualism.
Mm-hmm.
They just give it a number. But it's just beings that are more enlightened, higher up on the enlightenment scale than you are. And I said he said, when someone gets high enough clearance for looking glass technology, one of the first thing 9 times out of 10 they ask for is to see Christ. And he said even the Satanists do that. He said, but nobody's allowed to step through because it would be like something cataclysmic. Like no one's allowed to step through the looking glass and alter that period of time whatsoever. Because he didn't go into why, but he just said even the Satanists know better than that. Like nobody is allowed to step through and alter that period of time.
Yeah, because third density planets like Earth have a huge say in the rest of the galaxy, so I understand. But do you mind if I quickly scan through my most trustworthy source when it comes to hidden history about Egypt in particular, so to see if it meshes with what you were saying?
Of course.
Cool. So it's called the Freedom Teachings, and so it claims that the Egyptians descended from the avian race Ceres Seraphim, and it's one of the 7 root races. So initially, it was they come from the higher harmonic universe, and they were supposed to bolster up and prop up humanity, help them evolve. And this stems back to all the real humans, the angelic so-called humans that are here now, originated in a 5D future Earth called Tara, and they hold the universal genetic library. But the alien hybridization fractured their consciousness, and Tara itself fell, and that's how shards of it, got put inside the cores of the planets inside our solar system. So basically, it forces the reincarnation on Earth to heal the DNA. So this whole thing is an attempt for us to heal the future Earth, the future 5D Earth. However, the ongoing fallen angelic attempts to steal this DNA for enslavement and to hybridize themselves for them to evolve through different genetic programs has been stalling us. So this is where Atlantis comes in. Their scholars knew about the impending cataclysm that was to come in their civilization, so they spread seeds of knowledge in certain hotspots in the world, including Egypt. And for a while, they cohabited, the Atlanteans and even the highest of the primitive peoples and aliens cohabited in certain centers of spirituality. But this was only at the beginning, about 32,000 to 28,000 years ago. Afterwards, the Luciferian rebellion happened. During the Atlantean cataclysm and what's known as the Luciferian rebellion about 28,000 years ago, planetary stargates and ley lines became controlled completely by the negative alien agendas, such as the Anunnaki and the Alpha Draconis and Orion group Draconians. They seized ET technology, conducted human genetic experiments, caused DNA damage, solidified control on Earth's consciousness. And the Black Sun agenda replaced authentic Egyptian history with Egyptian pantheon and black magic rituals enforced by Temple of Set kings, Hyksos, and Amun snake priesthoods. And these groups shaped even the Greek mystery schools and secret societies like the Knights Templar and Freemasons. And they actually misrepresented Akhenaton, who was supposedly a law of one advocate, but they made him to be a Luciferian to advance the New World Order. And this is not this source, but Donald Marshall was saying that Obama is actually a clone of Akhenaton. So this is probably what this material is referring to, why Akhenaton was, misappropriated by them. And the Anunnaki hybridization with Nephilim distorted our genetic template and led to these positive confederacies to try to counter them by sending more advanced strains of Ceres Egyptian royal lines to restore law of one teachings to counter the Anunnaki control. So it's a constant back and forth. And also, they don't just control the Ark of the Covenant, the Anunnaki and other fallen angelics. They control the inner Earth gateway and the portal to the sun. That is also nearby, I think, in Egypt. And even the Sphinx is actually 25,000 years old. It was lifted from a town called Helios on what is now a town that is now under the Mediterranean Sea. But the rest of the Giza Plateau was built just after the Atlantean cataclysm, and it's had many purposes. But just like you said, it was mostly communication with the races that built them. Even the sizes of the three main pyramids reflect exactly the proportion of the three biggest stars in Orion. So that's probably what they were communicating with. And of course, it's not just the stone on top of the pyramid, which those help too to channel the magnetic energy, but it's also the chambers inside and the advanced technologies, which are usually crystal based, that help this. And also, they don't just help communicate, but also infuse the DNAs with the template that they choose. Or it facilitates astral travel, conscious astral travel to these planets of these gods, so-called. And as I said, Yeshua studied these essential rites but also Thoth. But Thoth is considered maybe a good influence, but he wrote that famous Emerald Tablet. But he actually is an Anunnaki figure who incarnated as an Egyptian priest during the Atlantean mystery schools. And rather than aid spiritual initiation, he deceived the followers and aligned with the invaders from a fallen matrix to promote Anunnaki superiority over angelic humans. So, yeah, and you mentioned the great pillars under the Great Pyramid. And from what I understood from a whistleblower, John Whitberg actually, he traveled to those as a child, and there were enormous shafts. So in addition to what you said, they also doubled as enormous shafts with spiraling staircases that you can climb down. And when you got to the bottom, there was an ancient ET, like underground dwelling. I say ET because it had a portal in it, which led to allegedly a progenitor race, so an abandoned planet that had artifacts like a version of Egypt, but much higher scale. But that's supposedly why Egypt looks the way it does, and also why it's actually spread out in other places of the world, because they have a network. There's Egyptian artifacts in a cave in Peru. But anyway, the pyramids were a necessity on Earth 100,000 years ago. It became a necessity after the initial reptile invasion. But the fallen angelic invasion has gotten so bad that even the plasma intelligences, like maybe what we would call angelic realms, have had to have been pushed from about treetop level on Earth to about 40,000 feet over the ground. So they can only interact with us sometimes when we are in certain airplanes. But even then, most of the humans that are now incarnated are too low vibration and don't have enough, brightness of the light body for them to even interact with us. But it does happen above that altitude. So yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree with you with the avian, as I said before. And I remember Robert telling me that the reason why the Middle East is so disputed is because it has the most portals in the world. So that whole Middle Eastern Egyptian area, he said there's the most naturally occurring portals, exist all throughout the world. It's mainly right there in the Middle East. And that's why there's always wars there. It has nothing to do with oil or Israel or Palestine or any of this stuff. It's just everybody wants to control that area because there is a lot of portals. There's a huge concentration of portals there. And he said that third density beings can't see or use portals. He said that if I had a reptile carrying me through the looking glass to take me to the moon, and that's where the moon is almost used as like a jumping off point. That's where ships take off from the dark side of the moon and everything like that. So you go through a portal through an underground base, and then you wind up in the moon. And he said that if you weren't pushed up artificially into fifth density, you wouldn't have been able to use that portal. And I said, well, what would have happened? He said, well, the reptile just would have walked through, but you would have fell on the ground. Like that, it was as simple as that. So he told me that the Arch of Babylon was real, the one they put in the courtyard of the Vatican for a while, for tourists to see. He said that's an active portal. He said, but because we're or third density, and only fourth density beings and above can use portals, we can't see the portal. We can walk through the arch and nothing happens. It's just like air to us. And it's just something about third density beings, which were being artificially pushed down and kept at third density. And, that's the reason why we haven't ascended yet. It's because it's like an artificial hell, I guess you would say they would create for us, like a Luch factory almost of like yeah.
I can actually shed light on exactly how that, and the veil, what exactly the veil is, if you want.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So the frequency fence was imposed by negative ETs. The net stands for Nibiru Electrostatic Transduction Field. It was anchored into Earth using the Nibiru Crystal Temple Network during the Luciferian Rebellion, and by impinging scalar sonic pulses at the Earth's inner grid system, an interference pattern or electrostatic force field was created, and it enshrouded the Earth. And this net has the effect of stopping incoming and outgoing signals, in particular to the higher dimensions, such as to the Guardian founder races, and creates some kind of quarantine. It blankets our civilization and isolates it from its natural connection to its inner consciousness and spiritual levels. And the field system interfaces naturally with the man's existence and constitutes a holographic insert. So it's like a false ascension realm. And surveillance of the Illuminati by the crystal star families or starseed families is also blocked due to the cloaking and scrambling effect. It causes false readings, and many starseeds are here for this reason, to be on the ground for reconnaissance work.
And he did mention something about, we're covered by a field. I don't know if it was the Van Allen belt or something like that. Maybe it was something similar to that, but he did mention that like we were kept in a matrix. He used the word matrix, and we're kept in like a field, and that's why we're artificially, put in a third. And I know a lot of people like talk about the Mayans and things like that, but Robert told me that like the Mayans and the Aztecs, not their fault, but those pyramids were created by the reptiles, and the entire point of those pyramids was Luch harvesting. That's why walking slowly up the steps to wait to get your heart cut out while you're still alive. Could you imagine the fear of the anticipation of that happening to you, this sacrifice, things like that? That's why they had so many, like Quetzalcoatl, or I forget whatever the accent is properly. It's a town in Mexico. And like these, I remember when I was in the military, I went to Honduras and I got to see the pyramids in Copan. And there was just reptile heads everywhere carved into the sides of these pyramids. And the tour guide told us is because they had such a great fascination with iguanas, because there's a lot of iguanas in Central America. But yeah, and I said that to Robert, and he said, no, those were real. Those are their gods. And like he said, like the point of those, they were different than the Egyptian pyramids. He said that the Egyptians were built by the avians, but the Mayan and the Aztec were built by the reptiles, and their entire point was just so they could all get high, basically, or sustain or live. I don't know what the Luch exactly does to them. I know it gives them like a high. And I remember after, Sobeck was done with me, he said something like that was a good feast or something like
Oh,
that. He said that. Yeah, I remember him saying that out loud. But yeah, he said that the whole point of those pyramids was yeah, just for Luch harvesting, basically, just to cause fear, pain, all those negative emotions.
yeah, they were beacons of dark energy, but each race on Earth, it seems to have one. So one for each continent, just like how the Atlanteans left to make outposts on each one of each continent, and they seem to represent that particular race. That in turn means the particular ET, because the races were a result of genetic projects done by ETs. And I heard that the Atlantean pyramids were much more complex than any of what we have on offer right now, because they blended different multiple styles of ETs. And this goes for the way that we even look at knowledge. Back in Atlantean days, it was basically one single discipline that encompassed everything. The need for multiple ones, segregation, happened because of how dumbed down we were after Atlantis. And of course, many of these domains started actually in Egypt, like maths and alchemy and writing, hieroglyphics and papyrus. And this was, I found kind of interesting, is that you said that the South American ones were reptiles, but I heard the Indian pointy pyramids were made in Pleiadian style.
Could have been. He didn't go into. I don't remember him going into that, but he was just. And I remember that memory because I saw these pyramids firsthand. When I was in the Navy as a Seabee, and yeah, like it could have been. Could have been.
Cool. And when you said all of these wars up to today are, actually secretly triggered by ETs wanting to control stargates, but that also, I think, means control the genetics of the people through genetic breeding programs, because they want to hybridize to continue to make sure that they are compatible vessels with us, in order to in turn gain entry into these stargates, because we the let's say the people who still have some angelic human in them are the ones that are carrying basically the keys to a lot of these stargates. So only we can open them. So that's why they have to infiltrate themselves, merge with our genetics, and open up these stargates for all the energy to come in and for them to feed on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, I think it's also maybe these elites and things like that. I wouldn't doubt if they were a hybrid, if they could use Stargate themselves, or I mean, they have density chambers and underground bases. He told me this. He said every underground base has a density chamber. They can be pushed up into a higher density, in the fifth density. He told me, all these underground bases have stargates. They have portals. They could use portals. All these underground bases have med beds, have age regression chambers. They have healing tanks. I was told that a med bed and an age regression were two different things. It's not a type of med bed. It actually, I think it's 5 days, he said, for 10 years. So for 20 years, they could be age regressed 20 years. They actually have to send you back further 10 days in advance for the age regression to happen. And it puts you in almost like a stasis. And basically, you just get a series of injections, is what he told me. And that slowly age regresses you. And yeah, and that's why I was, when I was signing the contract with the first class petty officer before I joined the program, I was like, I don't know if I should do this. And he said, you're already back there, so just sign the damn contract. He said that to me, and it was just like, and it was weird. I got this eerie feeling like I was in a time loop. And Robert explained to me that the reason, I was already back there is because I was actually being age regressed. I was going through the age regression process, even though I didn't need to be, he said. He said, you age like them, age like the Nordics. is how he put it. And he said, you look like the way you do right now, except for you were bigger, you were, stronger. He said, but you looked like, you were 28, about 28 years old, even though you'd been in the program for, I think I was in there for about 21 years and 2 months is what I estimate. They took me 10 months early. I got a 2-year extension because they saw me as special or something. But yeah, like they actually took me 10 months early from the 2-year contract. So yeah,
And
I did. He said I didn't need to be age regressed, but it's just part of protocol. It's just something that they did. It's just what they do when you come back.
and I was going to ask, I remember that it was creepy when they said that you were already on base, meaning your time loop self. But this is a theory that there's a prominent whistleblower who's saying that the SSPs are contractually obligated to send you only on alternate timelines and not this one. But I think that your testimony contradicts that and proves the opposite, because at least the guy with one of the guys on the REF base um, basically could meet himself. So it
Yes,
means it's
yes.
the same timeline.
The first class petty officer. Yeah, he was heavy set. He wasn't considered important enough to have tech in his body. I remember that. Like when you work in the mines of the moon and everything like that, you're not considered. You don't have tech in your body. So he was overweight. He wasn't over. You're not overly strong. I was when I was in the Dark Fleet. I was huge, but then once I got put in the Solar Warden, I was allowed to be a bit slimmer. I was so big that it was uncomfortable, but I was allowed to be a bit slimmer. And yeah, he was overweight, blonde, had a blonde mustache, and he said he mentioned someone's name, and it was the person that always won the physical readiness test, is what they call it in the military, the PRT test. And he said, and everybody on base knows that guy because he wins that. He runs the fastest, does the most push-ups, the most sit-ups. He said, you know him? And I said, yeah. He said, well, that's me. He's like, I think he said he was about 35 years old. He said, I'm 35 now. I'm in the program. And he was thinking about like reing up for another 20 years. He wasn't sure yet. And he also said he made investments that would be given to him. You know what I mean? I guess he should. I don't know if he should have done that or not, but he made investments to himself in the future, for his younger self. Difficult, time travel is confusing, so on and so forth. He would eventually, I guess, get these investments once he reached a certain age or something after coming back from the program, is how he put it. But yeah, he said, that's me. Don't tell him. You know what I mean? He's not. That's why I have the mustache. It's like a disguise. So yeah, that's what he. And talking about timelines, that movie Butterfly Effect with Ashton Kutcher had come out on DVD during this time. And so I was kind of thinking about that. I was trying to piece this together as Robert was telling me everything in the office, and I was thinking of every sci-fi movie, trying to make any kind of sense out of this. And I said, well, I talked about timelines, and I said, well, couldn't that alter the timeline, or aren't there multiple timelines and things like that? And Robert just said, like, it doesn't work that way. He said there are multiple timelines, they branch out, but then there are convergence points where they all come back together again, and then they come out again. And that's kind of like how it works. It's like multiple timelines, and then major points on Earth or in the universe itself where they all come together as one again, and they become one solid timeline again, and then they branch out again and they become one again. So that's kind of like how he explained it. I'm not sure if that's real, but he didn't seem to think, whenever I said something about, we could alter the timeline or we could do this, and he's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Like, that's not how it is. And he explained to me that, his time was 2580, and, about he had wars and a mass breeding program where everybody looked like Mike Pence, and because he was looking down my timeline and he said, you think I look like Mike Pence? And I said, like, well, who's that? And he's like, he becomes vice president of Trump. And I said, the billionaire? He goes, yeah, he becomes president. And I was like, what? He was telling me all this stuff. And he said that his timeline basically collapsed. Now I hear people say that they don't collapse. They actually are just branched off into a
Absorbed, yeah.
separate timeline. Yeah, but as far as what he told me, he said his timeline was, he said, my brother, he said, I said, well, what about your parents? He told me this, and I said, well, what about your parents? And he said, like, my mom's gone, my dad's gone, my brothers and sisters are gone, all my friends are gone. And I said, why? I said, well, is your wife from that timeline? And he said, no. And then I said, well, what will happen to your daughter? And he said, I don't know. And he looked really scared, like he was about to cry. And I said, why are you still here? And he said, I don't know. Like he had no idea why he was still here. But as far as what he knew, as far as what he told me, his timeline had completely been erased, collapsed, or something like that. Yeah.
It's possible that his initial timeline was actually created, through advanced artificial intelligence, like from the another universe, maybe basically a false reality, and they had to save themselves. It's called a Red Cube AI, and the creepiest part is apparently they're headquartered in the Carpathian Mountains. Yeah, it creates false realities. I don't know if it's the same one, but it's definitely a huge threat. And they're the ones who actually create the Egyptian pantheon grid clones to fuel Orion Group's black magic money system and maintain wealth for satanic bloodlines. So they're the ones behind the cloning of ancient Egyptians like Oprah, Lil Wayne apparently, and Obama and others.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I asked him. He said, I said, why did you have to go back to, fix the timeline? And he said we couldn't go beyond fifth density, and if a world doesn't keep evolving, it dies. And when he said die, I said, what do you mean dies? And he just basically said the rivers dry up, the lakes dry up, like the crops die. He said everything the earth becomes like Mars. It just dies. It becomes like a desert planet. And that's how he explained it. If you don't keep evolving, if you don't keep ascending to the next, then if you are stagnant for too long at one density, then your world dies. And he said that we couldn't get past fifth. He said if you make it to ninth, and he said that that was the highest density that we know of. That's what he said to me. And he said that there could be something higher than ninth, but not even ninth density beings know anything higher than them. He said if we could make it to ninth, we could just coast until, this happens again, or however, he kind of acted like it just kind of, not necessarily happens again, but it's just we all kind of come back as one consciousness, and whatever you want to call it, God, prime creator, experiences all of our experiences, and that's like the point of life. And that's why even for ETs, like suicide is considered like a bad thing, because you're denying yourself the experience. It's not supposed to be good or bad or happy or sad. It's just like you're here for an experience, and that's what you're here for. And I guess eventually it'll just happen again. And he said this has happened before, but it might as well be infinity for ninth density beings, because it's so far off into the future that, but eventually we'll all just become one again, and then boom, it'll happen again. And it's almost like a Big Bang theory, but more like in a spiritual sense, I guess you would call it.
And our ability to go up through the levels, of ascension is why these aliens are meddling with us so much. But do you mind if we go through to some more maybe rapid fire questions that we haven't covered before?
Yeah, shoot.
Cool. So have you ever noticed another whistleblower that said things that only someone who was inside would have known? So basically something that, or maybe even, did you recognize anyone from the Earth here and now from your testimony other than Aquino?
Did I recognize anybody from Earth? Well, as far as anybody I've watched on video, what's his name? He's British. He died of a drug overdose, supposedly. I forget his name. He was big, like at the beginning of YouTube. He was more than an experiencer. He knew a lot. He talked about the Hilton, portals being in the Hilton hotels. He talked about a lot of the Kundalini, the serpent wrapped around the spine, things
Max
like
Spears,
that.
or
Max Spears, yeah. Max Spears, his testimony, what he says is like, it sounds like it's coming out of the mouth of Robert. Like a lot of the things he says is on point. Like Max Spears, I'm 100%, he was real. If he was I think he claimed he was in a program and things like that. But as
oh
far
yeah,
as like the associations with what is it? The band, what was it called? 5 Seconds Till Mars or something like
30
that.
seconds.
30 Seconds Till Mars. When he talked about, that there's a countdown and everything else like that. Max Spears resonates with me like more than anyone else. And if like you should watch every single Max Spears video if you want to know. He knows the details that I don't. Mostly what I know is just family memories, things you would remember. I don't remember my 9 to 5 grind as much. You know what I mean? Just like it, just memory in real life. It's like I don't remember it because it was just something I kind of walked through. It was just, it was something, this repetition over and over again. But I have more family memories. And a lot of my memories are from what Robert told me because those memories are kind of different. You know what I mean? It's like the memory for the program, it's just so difficult to remember it because it's almost like fifth density memories trying to put it in third density words is how I explain it because it's so different. It's not what you think. You're going into your timeline, you're coming back, you're going into the future. You don't know how you got there for 3 seconds, and you boom, you just come back all of a sudden into the present. That's kind of like how fifth felt. The time is an illusion. It was more of an experience. You experience that whole time as an illusion thing in fifth density than you would in third. And yeah, in the whole thing with Sobek, Aquino, that memory, because I was already pushed that back down in a third or at least partially fifth, is how Robert explained it to me. That memory is more attainable, more graspable to me. And the memories I have with Robert, that's just like you and I talking together is how it feels. That's like a very solid, concrete memory to me. And he was saying things. He was saying the things you're talking about, the matrix, the net, the field, and things like that. But I mean, I was a guy who worked construction. This was just kind of like I was just kind of like thinking like I have all these kids, you know what I mean? Like I was just running that through my head over and over again. I was in shock. So a lot of the things he was telling me was just like it didn't make any sense to me, and I didn't even know what looking glass was. I didn't watch YouTube, I didn't watch videos on things like this. I had no idea that any of this existed. But yeah, I would say Max Spears most definitely. And as far as like people I've met. I mean, I've had people write me emails. I really don't. I don't know. It's just I had a weird encounter, just a while back, several months ago, where I walked into a restaurant near my house after I already called the order in. You know, 10 minutes before, and I walked in to get my order, and it wasn't ready yet. And there were two Navy chiefs, a male and a female, and I had never seen two, military Navy chiefs there before. And they're in uniform, and they look like they were about 28, maybe 30. And a chief is like, you're in your 40s by the time you make chief. You know what I mean? So these people are way too young. And it was just very suspicious. And they were just looking at menus and not talking. Usually when you're at a new restaurant, you're like, "Oh, this looks good," and people are talking back and forth about what they're going to order. They were just dead silent, and they were just, and looked way too young to be chiefs. And yeah, like it was very awkward and strange. And yeah, I mean, I've had things like that happen to me before, where it doesn't make any sense. But I mean, as far as recognizing people, not really. I mean, no.
That's also probably because you spend so much time with quote unquote them, the Cladians.
Yes, yes, and yeah, and it was yeah, and I basically lived in their side of the quarters. I worked with other people from Terrans is what they call us, Terrans. But yeah, I worked with Terrans and things like that, and I knew people, but I mostly lived with them and conversed with them.
Hmm. So, in our first interview, you hinted at being involved in shooting down German ships that were incoming from the portal of the sun, sometimes dozens a day. But I never followed through. I was wondering, what was your actual role in these fights, and were you piloting a fighter, or were you manning like a gun from a large spaceship? And also maybe paint a picture of the one of the battles itself.
Well, I mean, I was a pilot of a starship, so it was more like the navigator. If we were actually in a firefight, he would take over for weapons and things like that. I was more navigations, and I was more, I mean, piloting, and he was more navigations, weapons. And the way of a firefight works, I remember we were, and yeah, it was pretty much the reason that with the Germans and everything else is Earth is on lockdown and nothing is allowed to leave or come in. And that's what I remember from it. And we were mostly just kind of guarding our solar system, guarding Earth from anything from entering or exiting. And so they would come in from portals from the sun and things like that. And yeah, that's something else people don't realize. The sun is more like I don't know, like an interdimensional portal, a transformer that brings a power source from another kind of dimension into ours. It's less about what they think fusion and things like that, and it's more like a portal. And even some scientists agree to that they don't know what it is, and because all these professors at universities have all this tenure about fusion and things like that, that nobody wants to let this go, let this lie go, and that's basically why it hangs on. But I mean, I remember being in like a conflict with the Draconian Empire, And what I remember is the shields are way too strong. They're too strong to actually be taken down by weapons and things like that. They're very strong shields. And it's actually what it is it's such an advanced ship that it frequency hops. You know what I mean? And their band of frequency at fifth density is much more vast than our band of frequency. And it frequency hops, I don't remember how many times per second, but very quickly, faster than anything we can have. And what you're doing is you're actually sending kind of like a shock wave from your shields to hit their shields and trying to match their frequency of shield is kind of how it works. Because I remember there was a hangar bay area in the ship, and it was almost like an amphib, like an amphibious ship, where smaller craft would fly out of the back. And because the smaller craft had the exact same shield frequency that's constantly skipping, but they're skipping at the same time. These smaller craft have the same frequency as the mothership. They can fly right through the shield without having to put the shields down. They can just fly right through because it's the same exact frequency. And so what you're doing is what the ship is doing, and it's one of the few times they use an actual soul, like a consciousness
The
for
Pleiadians, you mean?
yeah, the Pleiadians for a technology, because it's such an advanced AI that they actually need a soul to man this, AI of the ship, of the computer itself, of the ship. And yeah, it sends shock waves out, the shield itself. And basically what it's trying to do is match the shock wave, the same shield frequency as the enemy ships, because they're all on the same shield frequency. So even the smaller craft will lose their shields and everything else. And that's basically what it is. It's kind of like a standstill in the beginning until their shields get knocked down. And then you basically just try to take out the major components of the ship to disable it. Because as I said before, like ETs are scavengers. They want to look for new technology. Maybe there's beings that are enslaved by, whatever you want to call it, the tech, the black goo that they put into them and things like that. And they're kind of slaves to the Draconian Empire. Maybe there's souls they want that are captured in like these small little vessels that they can actually keep a consciousness in and stuff. So they want the ship intact. They don't want the ship blown apart. They don't just blow it apart. They try to disable it. And that's what I remember from like conflict on ships.
Interesting. So, did you see well, how did the sun look from closer to it, from outside the atmosphere?
I mean, there were, spurts that seemed like explosion, kind of like long tendrils that would come out of it and things like that. I do remember things like that. But jumping through it was like anything else, like jumping through stars. And sometimes they have jumps in space. You would use jumps in space, jumps through stars. I remember, yeah, and Robert telling me going through portals, going through jumps, going through stars, anything like that. It's almost like you cease to exist. Your body, anyways, your flesh and bones cease to exist. So it's kind of like you go through a portal, and then it's just your soul that passes through. And then once you reach the other end, your body comes back. And I said, like, well, how does that happen? And he really didn't know how it worked. He said it just does. And he said that when ETs are in active duty, when they're going through a lot of jumps and portals and things like that, they have to get their DNA realigned. They go into a med bed like once a week to get their DNA realigned, because it going through so many jumps and portal can actually distort your DNA itself. So it's a common thing for them to go into a med bed just once a week just to get that realigned.
Yeah, I heard that it's the mitochondria gets disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
But so did you ever feel like maybe regret that you were, let's say, killing your own kind when you did have to take them down, or what did you do with the? Because some of those German ships allegedly were also of refugees who were just fleeing from decrees of whatever other, aliens that banished them.
I mean, it was just. I mean, that's just the way it was. We were on lockdown, and we couldn't trust anyone. As far as like, you know what I mean? Like it didn't matter. We couldn't trust anyone going in or coming out. And it's just Earth is going through a very sensitive kind of like ascension, and it cannot be disturbed. Like, and that was just my memory of it. What was explained, like it cannot be disturbed, and it was just. Guilt? I don't know. I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, but I mean, for the longest time, I held a grudge against the Germans. You know, I finally letting that go, and it's just I found them almost more despicable than the reptiles, I guess you would say, because I felt like they were traitors to their own people, their own kind. You know what I mean? I saw them as like Judases. I remember I didn't like them, and I remember if we had a meeting with them, sometimes we would talk peace, and sometimes only Germans would show up, off-world Germans, and um, if we couldn't reach any kind of a point of you know, any kind of you know, terms of peace or reach any kind of conditions with each other, I would always say something to them like, you know, you be good little disciples, and you tell your gods what we discussed here today. You know what I mean? Like, because that's how I saw it. I saw the reptiles as just like a, or I saw the off-world Germans as just like a people that would just do whatever the reptiles said without question. You know what I mean? And I just did not like that. I didn't, you know, I didn't like that about them.
But now you've come to believe that much of that was just programming that was instilled in you as part of the Solar Warden, right?
Maybe it's part of Solar Warden, but I mean, it's part is like just what I, you know, what I went through from being in the Dark Fleet and things like that. I held a grudge against these people, and I didn't like them, and you know, and I remember processing out of the military, and I had to go to medical one last time for like one last physical from St. Morgan, and I just had a hunch, you know, because I remember I went to medical, and you know, I started getting like dandruff, like really bad dandruff, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I asked the doctor, and the doctor said like, "Oh, it's probably something you had or got from your, you know, your parents and blah blah blah." And then I found out later from Robert that, you know, the Germans, just to add insult to injury, were like doing stuff to my body, making my skin too thick, just like, you know. And I mean, and I started getting like dander and stuff, and I never had that before. And I remember he said that it was Aquino's idea to lower my threshold of pain in the med bed, because I guess I didn't scream enough when I was being tortured. You know what I mean? He felt like I wasn't suffering enough, so I had my threshold of pain lowered. And you know, I said, "Is that doctor, that lieutenant, is he an off-world German?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You make sure that, you know, he knows who I am, and you tell him I know who he is, because I'm going to see him tomorrow." And then when I went into medical and I saw him, he didn't put a stethoscope on me, nothing. We just started communicating, as they call it. And you know, I basically said the same thing to them. It was just something in my subconscious I remembered, and I said like, you know, something about your gods, talking about the reptile. I would always call them your gods to them. And he said, "Well, it may seem like that," but and I said, "Don't condescend to me." I said, "I remember everything. Like I remember everything. I know exactly I said you would sacrifice your own children if they asked you to." And he said, "No, we wouldn't." And I was still of that mindset where I just did not like them. And he eventually got to a point where he said, "You know, we're helping you." So Robert told me the same thing, and this lieutenant, this doctor, was an off-world German. He told me the same thing. He said that I guess there's breakaways, not only breakaways, but there's something called Kruger, which Robert explained to me, which is like a corporation from like an alternate Germany where Germany won World War II, and they were like working with the Pleiadians to try to figure out interuniversal jumping from universe to universe. And Robert explained to me that there's I think eight different universes that we know of, at least Kruger, and they're the only ones that have this tech. Like the Pleiadians from their universe and them, they know this tech, and it's a way, and no one knows, not Andromedans or Arcturians, doesn't matter how high the density is, they don't know how to jump from one universe to another, but they have like a tech that where they know how to go from one universe to another. And it seems to be like there's an AI in a separate universe. And that's why AI is so, that's where the hive mind consciousness of the AI is. And that's why it's so hard to combat. And that's what the reptiles have in them. And that's what, if you get captured by the reptiles or you get put in the dark fleet, you get this AI and you kind of have this hive mind consciousness from this separate consciousness in a different universe. And I guess basically what the battle plan is to try to get as many universes together on the same page and then try to defeat this AI that's in a separate universe that they have the technology to combat.
you think it could be that it's actually the same fallen, it's called the Phantom Matrix, that all these races, the fallen angelics like Anunnaki and Draconians are coming from? Do you think that's what is actually what they mean by different universe, the one that has severed its connection to the highest gate of D12 frequency of density 12?
Yeah. I mean, it could be, and I do remember hearing that the reptiles were actually kind of like pushed out of their universe because they were just so much of a problem and put into ours. And I guess our higher density beings thought it was. I don't know if they thought the balance was off or something. Maybe it was too positive and they needed a little bit. So they welcomed this new negative force into our universe, but then it kind of blew up in their face.
Yeah.
And these higher density beings are trying to like help us figure this out, and they're on the path to try to fix this.
It is a very tight balance, a fine line, because I I have it on pretty good authority that another audiobook I'm going to translate that says that the fall of Atlantis, the real reason for it is that that whole race, even though it was much smarter than us, much more advanced, much more sophisticated, it didn't do the thing that it was actually put here to do, part of the great human experiment, which is to actually merge the two perspectives of reptilian and, let's say, human, which I think that Robert told you that you are a rare blend of those two. But actually, what I'm saying is we have no chance but to try to set right the, this calling, this mission of ours, because otherwise we're going to face the same fate as the Atlanteans. So we do have to work together somewhat. Like I think you said, the duality of the world is the Satanists and the Anglo-Saxons. It's probably a microcosm of that.
Yes, and yeah, all worlds have a duality. And you reminded me of something else, and something else that Robert told me. He said that before all this, flesh and blood, the physical, there was once a time in this universe where I'm not sure if we were just spirit beings or what, how he kind of explained it, but we were all on one level, on one page, and we were all like at peace and harmony. And it was just like a paradise. It was like a, like a Garden of Eden kind of thing on like a spiritual level. And he said that some sort of major cataclysm happened that they don't know what it was, but like there was a major cataclysm. And basically what all ETs, positive and negative, Pleiadian and reptile, they're all kind of like striving to try to get back to what once was. And like
Yes.
there was just some sort of like art, like I don't know what it was. He said a cataclysm happened that no one knows what it was.
I actually hinted at it. It was the Tara. Tara was the name of the heavenly Earth, and they took a fall through something akin to the Atlantean. So they have kind of their own Atlantis, but on a higher density. So when that happened, that's when they implode. They basically caused their entire morphogenetic field of their higher dimensional Earth to fall, and all the consciousness is the only way for them to not turn to ash, because that's the only two things that can happen to a consciousness. Either they return to source, or they basically get nuked and still part of source, but they lose all the memory. So in order to avoid that, they split themselves into all these little pieces, which we are one of them. So yeah, we're just little fragments of the old Tarans, not Terrans. But going back to the ships, so the shield trick worked with human ships. But what about, did you ever encounter ET ships that were too evasive, that were above your tactics, maybe had a different combat?
No. These ships were top of the line. These were the most advanced ships. Now, if you're talking about certain things, I mean, I believe they're called Arcturians, what people call them. They were blue skinned. They had the big black eyes. Their pupils looked like swirling blue galaxies almost. It was like they were higher density. I think like eighth or ninth. I think we're on ninth density. They were very high density beings. Now they could do things like they could just show up on your ship, because like that's just like the higher density they were. It didn't matter if you had your shields up or not, and they were used almost. They would just come into play, and they would know that it was time to be here, and they would we're good at like negotiations and meetings and things like that. You could have two factions, warring factions that were at each other's throats, and they could walk into a room and everybody would just calm down. It was like it's strange. They could just calm the room, and they were kind of like they would be there as like negotiators to try to figure out a problem, reach a solution to this. But I remember those higher density beings could do things like that. Shields weren't even an option for them. They didn't use craft. They didn't use ships. Robert explained to me the way the universe works in the sense of like in relation of densities, and I have explained this before, but it's true. It's like it's a cone. It's kind of how he said it. We're at the bottom. We're third. Getting from one end of the universe is impossible. It's just too vast. Fifth is kind of in the middle. You know, getting from one end of the universe, you still need craft, but you can do it. And then you have ninth, and they're at the tip of the cone. And all they have to do is kind of like walk outside their front door and they are on the other side of the universe. And that's kind of like that's how in relation to like time and space and density to how it kind of works. It's not that the universe is in the shape of a cone. It's just it's a good way to look at it in relation to densities, how the universe is seen by higher density beings and lower density beings.
But they also would have to downgrade themselves a lot to interact with the Solar Warden and the Confederation, whatever, because they're 9D. So
You would think so, but maybe they had tech that would do that. Maybe they didn't. And I was on their world one time, and I remember that, and it looked like it was in a constant state of sunset. You really couldn't see the sun. It looked like it was in a constant state of sunset. There were clouds, purple. I don't remember rain. There were strange trees that looked almost like I don't know, like Dr. Seuss kind of esque kind of trees. It was bizarre. It was like foliage, you know, trunk, foliage, trunk, foliage, trunk. It kind of like, and I remember seeing trees like that. And I remember being on their world for a time, and it was just, yeah, a constant state of sunset is what it seemed like. There was no sunrise, there was no night or day. It was just constant sunrise or sunset, whatever you want to call it.
Hmm. And when you were not piloting Mama Bear, the ship, but were, you know, elsewhere, could you still hear her? Could you do like distance telepathy?
Telepathy works in the sense of the more you are communicate with another being or the ship, which is a soul, which is, you know, a soul itself, it works in the sense of the more of a telepathic link you have with someone, the more you communicate with them, the more you live with them, the stronger a link you build up. And you could actually, not only the ship, I mean, I could, but the ship was probably being used again because you weren't just constantly, you know, on a ship. You'd be at ship for long periods of time, but they had, you know, they had downtime. They had, you know, a port, you know, home port is what you'd call it in the Navy. They weren't just constantly on a ship, the people that were on the ship. So the ship was probably, you know, had a stronger telepathic link with someone else by the time I was on their world for, you know, at least a decade. You know what I mean? I was on their world for about a decade. But I like in the sense of telepathy, as far as distance, you could actually, you know, if somebody was on the ship and they were talking about you, it didn't, you know, it wasn't that it was bad. They were just interested in me, and they would discuss me sometimes. You would that whole expression, your ears are burning, was like different, like because you would kind of like it was almost like you were there for a small bit. As I said, you would find yourself going down timelines and up. So if somebody, if there were a couple people talking about you, wondering why I reacted this way, wonder why this happened, they were still trying to understand me and figure me out. It was almost like I was in the room with them for maybe a few seconds and I could hear what they were saying because I had such a strong telepathic link with these people that like yeah like sometimes even just someone even just beings talking about you telepathically you could kind of like you know I wouldn't call it you know butt in on the conversation or be nosy or whatever but you know when it comes to the telepathic beings you have no privacy you can't keep secrets you can't lie you know things like that can't happen you have to tell them the absolute truth you know, and things like that. Unless it's a much older being, they can kind of deceive you and things like that. But you know, when it comes to telepathy, you could usually kind of figure it out. And yeah, if somebody, if there were if there were other people on different parts of the ship, and I remember that, kind of like having a conversation about me, it was almost like I was there for a little bit, and I knew what they were talking about. I could just sense what they were talking about.
It reminds me of Robert telling you not to say Aquino's or the entity's name because you might summon them. But also, an interesting corroboration of that phenomenon is the best Romanian psychic and maybe psychic period called Valentina. She said that, well, she could peer into these unseen worlds, and um, she said that whenever a person's name is mentioned of someone that was still alive, that person's face would appear in the environment. So basically, was called onto it, he or she. So yeah, I was also going to ask about the psychic abilities like telepathy and stuff, and let's say energy manipulation. Did these, did you gain these automatically as part of the boost of the density chamber, or did you ever receive training in any of them?
Training, I mean, like I said, when I was younger, I remember being able to talk to my father that way. Like my father, my aunt, I remember that. My
But
mom didn't really know as much
but
telepathy.
yeah, but I mean like official, like militarized or whatever from one
Not
of the.
militarized, but through them, through like the Pleiadians and things like that. Like mother helped me a lot. She helped me open up more, able to do more. Elder, like the elder, like Pleiadians and things like that. They were, like I said, like once you hit like that, 2000 mark, you become just kind of like more experienced. You could do different things. And that's why when I hear like I don't know, channelers and things like that, like they would help me out with that. But when I hear people say that they channel the Pleiadians and they channel the Taigetans and things like that, and there's almost like on their world, they kind of have like a group of elders that protects them from any kind of like attack, any kind of psychic attack or things like that, any kind of spiritual level attack. And it's almost like you have to go through them first, and they kind of say like whether or not you can converse with somebody else. So they're almost like the protectors, like their older generation of beings are kind of like the channel the channeler protectors that they say whether or not you have the right to go any further, and if you don't, they'll just kind of blow you off and just get rid of you. And they have that ability. They're very powerful and very strong. And yeah, and I remember with mother, I remember a type of psychotherapy, I guess you would say where I had with her, where I had a lot of trauma from the Dark Fleet and things like that. And she would kind of just make me relive this event like it was like actually happening again. And then after it happened, she would ask me like the feelings I had, why I had these feelings, like what makes you fear this? What makes you hate this? Like, why do you feel this way? And she was able to do that. Yeah, and it was almost like a kind of psychotherapy where I was literally like reliving that moment, and she could find it and just in my timeline and have me relive it until it meant nothing to me anymore. And that's kind of like how it worked. And they call that healing. Like you need healing is what they would say to me, and that was like something I had to go through. Was like a healing period with her.
Interesting. Yeah, so it's about
Mhm.
confronting your shadow. But
Mhm.
when you were in Nachtwaffen or Soul Warden and you received the missions, was it like a notification in your glass pad, or was it like verbal, or was it maybe telepathic?
Well, in the Dark Fleet, sometimes you would just get up and not even like in the middle of sleep and not even know where you were going because you had the tech in your body. You know what I mean? It was almost like you had no control. When you were on your downtime, you had control. But as soon as whenever you had to do a mission and you went to a mission, it was almost like you were, a droid. It was almost like you were kind of programmed to do the next thing you had to do because you had this tech in your body. Um, what was the question you asked for the
Oh yeah,
positive?
so that's how you received the objectives of the missions. Also, it was like wireless through chips, right?
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, with just the ship, it was just we had a captain. We had a captain of the ship, and one of the agreements with the Pleiadians was, he gave us all the orders. And it was pretty much like military. You had a circle in the morning. You had the plan of the day, what our short-term goals were, what our long-term goals were, where we at, where are we in this war? Did we lose any ships? Did they lose any ships? You were always briefed every morning, like with a different kind of morning meeting. And that was like a big task of mine. I was actually kind of like a yeoman, which is like a secretary and like the Navy. And because leader, he didn't go to these meetings. He was a warrior caste Pleiadian, and he didn't go to these meetings. He just didn't want to stay out of it. And I would come back to him and I would report everything that I thought was pertinent to him, off a smart glass pad. I would just kind of like telepathically tell the smart glass pad, like, okay, highlight this, highlight that. And we would all be talking about it in like a circle in the beginning, and it was all Terrans, it was all people from Earth all together, like talking about this. And it was just whatever I felt like was pertinent to him, I would, advise him on. And if he wanted more, I would just read exactly what was said, by the captain in that morning and what was given to us through our smart glass pads. But I mean, as far as just, yeah, like missions and things like that, it was like the captain had his orders and he gave us our orders. It was kind of like that. And one of the agreements with the Pleiadians was, it was like I said, it was their tech, but our materials. But they could commandeer the ship at any time they wanted for any reason, no questions asked. And I remember one time leaders stepped up, and this was the man and the woman together. They were both leader. Him and his main wife, his queen, as they call it, like your main wife of how many wives you have. And one time he just stepped up to the captain and he said, "I'm assuming control of the ship." He said it out loud to him because the captain wasn't a telepath, and he just got up and walked away.
Do you remember the mission that he went on?
Yes. It was whenever we actually
Took down that den of adrenochrome?
no, that wasn't it. This was more like a meeting with the Draconian Empire, and it was taking weeks, and we were just kind of just, I don't know, you call it adrift or whatever, like our ships side by side, shields were down and stuff. It was like a peace treaty meeting. They were trying to bargain for peace with us. And I remember, we had the meeting. This is whenever the reptile struck Swaru, and I stabbed the reptile that struck her. It like regurgitated on my face. I didn't know that they could do that, and it burned my face. I had to go to a med bed. I had to explain myself. Anyways, when we got back to the ship, it was all the warrior caste males, and they were having like a meeting, and we were all just standing, and it was just like we're in a circle, just like people do, and leader said to me, "What do you think?" Because you lived with them. That was one of the reasons they wanted me to live with them in the Dark Fleet and everything. They knew that was going to happen to me, but they wanted me to have that experience to learn from it. And I said, I think that the reason they're asking for peace is because they're weak. And as soon as they gain their strength, they'll kill all of us and they'll enslave our women and children. And then leader said, I think he's right. And then he said, I said we should attack now while they're weak. We should attack them with everything we have while they're weak. And he said, I think they're right. I think he's right. And then he asked me, would you like to, assume command of some of your people, Terrans? And then that's when we came to the moon, and the moon was already free. And I recruited a bunch of people that were miners in the moon and things like that. And they fought alongside of us. And yeah, how that conflict worked was kind of like, the shields were already down. So they usually don't do this because you're not supposed to do it like under a banner of truce or whatever you want to call it. But the reptiles do it all the time. So I was like, we should just attack them now while their shields are down. And we disabled their ship, disabled their shields. And it's actually kind of like these, I don't know, they lock onto the sides of their ship and they cut through the hulls of the ship and blow it down. It gets knocked down, and then you just board the ship. So it was an actual like attack, and we were in the front. People from Earth, Terrans, were wearing certain kind of armor that could handle like high velocity fire, railgun, plasma, laser. They wouldn't have used laser or plasma in their own ship. It would have been railgun only. And they were using railgun, and our armor was developed to take that. And the warrior caste would stand behind us, kind of stooping down for like we were like tanks to them, like shields. And they wore a specific kind of armor that was meant for more of like their hand-to-hand combat weapons, which is almost like a sword they use. Once they get hand-to-hand, once it gets close enough, they go into hand-to-hand. And I remember that. Yeah, we were firing, and then he asked me during training, he said, like, what do you want the command to be for us to take over? like for us to go into hand-to-hand combat. And I said fixed bayonets. And he asked me why I said that, and I explained it to him. And then he said, you know, he got to a point where it got so close quarters combat. He said fixed bayonets, and they just kind of like leaped right over us. I remember feeling his foot like touching my shoulder, and they just went right over top of us, and they just went into hand-to-hand combat, and we were kind of like in the rear then. And that was kind of like how it worked on the ships, as far as like boarding a ship. Actually boarding a ship is what we did.
And I think that's when the leader said that he was supposed to die, but because you were an unknown variable, you changed the outcome.
No, that was in the conflict with the navigator. He was just a regular male. He was just like a normal male that could have daughters as well as sons. And yeah, like he said that because they can look down their own timelines, and that was in the conflict I was telling you before where the shields were down. And I just kind of took over the ship's consciousness, and uh, just I don't know how I did it, but I reached the frequency. He didn't think he was going to make it, because whenever higher density ETs know their own death, and they, you know what I mean, that they know their own death and they know when it's coming, but it's just something they accept, and it doesn't really affect them or bother them. They do have, like, the regular men do have a sense of fear, the women have a sense of fear, and the warrior caste don't. But yeah, like after the conflict was over, he looked over at me and he said, "How did you do that?" And I said, asked him what, and he said, "I was supposed to die. Like I saw my own death this day. Like, how did you change that?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "I guess," he said, "you were a variable we weren't expecting," is how he put it. And yeah, and that's how he put it, because higher density beings know their own deaths,
Mhm.
and they just accept it.
Although maybe you do invite a little bit of bad karma if you do this subterfuge kind of thing. But I think you were saying that the Draconians would have done it anyway. I mean, would have retaliated and would have gone against their word anyway. So in the end, yeah, it's.
They always do. Yeah, they always do.
Hmm. But what about, were there specific topics that were deemed too sensitive or dangerous that you were warned not to discuss in maybe within Solar Ward or not often?
Not Knockwaffen. I never really made it that high up until the very end, and even though then I was kind of like a, you know, I was almost like a select. I wasn't actually one of them. I was just kind of like on a probationary period. But I mean, yeah, I mean, there were plenty of things that they told me, they had confidence to tell me that I did not share with like the other Terrans, the other people from Earth. There was like plenty of plans that they had, you know, not only to help us but to help them. And yeah, there were plenty of topics that they would share with me privately that I didn't share with anyone else.
Hmm. But that's stuff that you have shared before, right? So I shouldn't
Yes.
stress. Yeah. But in the battle you just mentioned between the reptiles and the Pleiadians, the ambush, uh, were the reptiles using weapons that have, you know, souls of dangerous slain foes of the reptilians? And did they get a like a performance boost from having souls, you know, incorporated in the armor and the weapons?
Yes, yes. Like armor and weapons with negative ETs, they always have like a consciousness, a soul. And yeah, it is, because you can make a direct link, like a telepathic link, with even just like a weapon, a rifle, your armor. You don't have to think about things. It just knows exactly what you want at the same exact time that you want it. You know what I mean? You don't have to explain anything to it. It knows exactly what you want from it, and they use it. Yeah, they use consciousness for everything. It's almost like for negative ETs, like consciousness is kind of like silver, like in the universe. It's like traded often. It's like a trading commodity that they use. Yeah, that like trap souls, trap consciousness. They use it in all their tech on everything. Yeah.
So it gives you an edge, but I think that any computer that is complex will attract a soul of some type, maybe elemental or a lesser soul, but the Pleiadians just don't want to use souls of their own kind. That's what they think is unethical, except for when they have to, like in the ship.
And the ship, yeah, and the person and the soul volunteers, like, you know, themselves for this task, and it's not something permanent. You know, it's hundreds of years to us, but just, you know, not maybe a year to them. It doesn't seem very long to them. But you know, Yeah, it's they have like a way of bypassing, and it's not as efficient, but it's almost as efficient as what like the more dark the more negative ETs and things like that use. So they have a way to like bypass it. They have a technology to be able to bypass a type of artificial intelligence that's almost as advanced
So
as like
maybe an
one that
artificial
relies on
soul.
consciousness.
Artificial soul, maybe.
No, I don't think it's an artificial soul even. It's just a very high efficient kind of AI computer. And it's not really the same kind of AI. It's not the AI. It's just a very efficient computer, I would call it. You know what I mean? I wouldn't really even call it AI, but they figured out a way to kind of bypass it. It's not quite as efficient, but almost as efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, only for things like starships and things like that they actually use consciousness.
Hmm. What's the most advanced, most destructive weapon that you have seen in your career return?
I mean, the starships themselves are pretty
Mm-hmm.
destructive. They can cause a lot of damage. They're 4 kilometers long, as I said before. Um, and there's also like, I don't remember how it works, but there's ways of even masking your world from certain technology, from certain other beings and things like that. Where yeah, it could be there, but I don't even know how they do it. Like you figure there'd be a constant conflict on their own home world and things like that, and it's not like that. There's an actual way of like masking or somehow cloaking. I'm not really sure how it works, your own world. And
You
but
think
I
that's why
remember
you think that's why we don't see the Venusian and Martian civilizations?
that's why we don't see the civilizations, but it's not only that, it's because it's a higher density. Like I said, it changes, like the cone, but not only the cone changes, you might have like a Venusians, and it may see and it might seem uninhabitable at third density, but once you get to fifth, then it becomes the rivers of Mercury and things like that we say are on Venus, which is what I'm not 100%, but there's inhospitable is what we call it, but at a fifth density level, maybe that world is just fine. That world would be perfectly livable and perfectly, yeah. And that's a big reason why we don't see life on Mars and things like that. These are higher density beings. It's like you're in the same universe, but you're at a higher density. It's like it's the same radio, but you're on like a different station, a different frequency of that radio. And that's
Hmm.
the way I explain it. I don't know.
Makes sense. But in one of our previous ones, you said that the Pleiadians mostly rely on telepathy, but they do have kind of a script and ancient language. I think it's called Tamil. But do the other races have their own languages, and does it have ever practical uses? And maybe did you ever learn any of it?
I think I did. Don't remember. Uh, all ETs have a written language. The written word is like it is on a spiritual sense, very important. They all have a spoken language. It's usually used, and then they all have kind of like a religious like ceremony. They all have a religious belief. They all, you know what I mean? They I remember going to a wedding of one of my daughters, and it was all spoken out loud in their language and things like that. Certain ceremonies, certain religious activities, and things like that. They'll use their ancient languages aloud and things like that. They'll speak them aloud, and yeah, they all have a written word as well.
Hmm. But that's another thing I was going to bring up is how come you lived for so long in the Pleiadian world that you managed to attend your children's weddings?
Um, as soon as they show signs of puberty, which is about the same as us, about 12 years old, they get their tech in their body. And they're left alone when they're children. When they're in the womb. The tech in the mother's womb, like she programs on the smart glass pad. Stronger, more intelligent, things like that. While it's still cells, well, the baby are still just cells. And once it's done this several hundred times, augmented the cells several hundred times, it just replicates the augmentations naturally after it's done several hundred times. And then the tech lets go and just lets life happen as normal. And the children are allowed to grow up without any tech in their body at all. But as soon as they start showing signs of puberty around 12, the tech is put into their body. They're given a smart glass pad. They can, kind of manipulate the way they look, their face, everything, everything about them. I don't know, think they could change hair color or eye color, but how they want their cheekbones, their nose, everything. They're allowed to manipulate that as they go through puberty. And Robert explained this to me. So this is one of those like solid memories. He said that girls become women in 4 to 5 months, and boys become men in 7 to 8 months, because men take a little bit longer to grow than women. And yeah, so they just kind of accelerate and bypass puberty, and they have the minds of adults, they have the bodies of adults. They're considered an adult once they reach of age, like at that age, and they
It's
just kind
amazing.
of fast forward right through puberty. They don't
Hmm.
have to go through any of the awkwardness of puberty. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So another question no one really asked you is, um, during your short-lived stint as a king, did you actually take care of any, governance, or was it simply a matter of reproduction?
I think it was just a way to play on my ego. I mean, it was just a way to get me to do what they wanted me to do, because they could tell that I wasn't going to leave the women I was with at the time, that I didn't want to be a part of that. But if they made me king, then I would be willing to do it, because they were just playing upon my ego, I think is all it was.
Oh, okay.
And that was the whole point of it, yeah. And it was only, I think Robert told me like 4 months is
Mm-hmm.
like how long it lasted.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
And
not sure if their world or my world. Because something else I didn't bring up is Robert said that they live 3,000 years on our world on Earth, but on their world it's more like 1,000, because they're further away from their star. Their years take longer.
oh,
We're
okay.
very, very close. We're very close to our star. And that's why he told me like the native people of Earth are like the sub-Saharan African and the Aboriginal people. Those are the native inhabitants of Earth, he told me, because they have so much more melatonin. And that's why, the sun, ages us and burns our skin, because we're supposed to be actually out to the asteroid belt. We're not supposed to be, this close to the star, the sun.
Mm-hmm. Although we are supposed to, if not for the governors, to live at least 1,000 years, just like the Atlanteans did.
Well, Robert said over 800. He said the
Mm-hmm.
off-world Germans live over 800, and that's how long we're supposed to live. Yes.
As for the fact that even the draconians have to maintain a certain balance, such as to abide by the cosmic law of not going against the consent, that's why they need contracts as well. Do you know, or were ever told what is actually the means by which this karma is enforced? Is it like a cosmic self-regulating law, or is it like beings that do that?
It's the self-regulating law. Like they call it the balance. Yeah, there's like if you do this, then this will, cause an effect. It's just that. It's just a karmic balance, the balance they call it.
Hmm. Um, did you hear of any humans that were able to break out of maybe their soul contracts, like negotiate or something?
I did. I mean, with the reptile and things like that. I mean, I did it myself. I mean, as I said, it's just I had faith, and I prayed and things like that, and that's pretty much what got me out of it, was out of a contract or whatever you call it. Even though I wasn't, privy to this contract, I was just 7 years old, but it took me 40 years to get out of this contract or whatever it was. And I don't know if he had any kind of balance, negative balance against him, the reptile, for doing what happened, or if he was willing to just take this risk and he didn't care. But it's usually something you have to kind of like invite to happen in and things like that. But that's the reason like elites and things like that do that to their children. They molest their children and everything else. And it's just, they know it fragments the personality. They know it, you keep a personality that's always going to be a child, and children are geniuses. Like all children are geniuses, and they realize that. So that they always, and it, and so yeah, like as I said before, I did. I broke out of it. I did it, and I did it through faith, and praying, and that's
Hmm.
how I did it.
Although you believe that you did sign the contract, the soul contract, to be part of the programs, right?
Oh, I know I did. I know I did. Yeah, like that was me. Like I'm talking to you right now. Like I had a stack of papers like that, and the guy was flipping them for me, and he already had it X'd where I had to initial and sign. And I remember like the contract was things like, it was very strange. It was like the consciousness of the first party now belongs to the second party and things like that. It had very strange wording. It's something I never read before. And I just read like the first few paragraphs. And that's when he said, like, if you read this, we'll be here all night. Just sign the damn contract, And when you're in the military, you do that. You just sign contracts, or you just sign your name, because there's so many times you have to sign powers of attorney. You have to sign this. You have to sign that. You don't even think about it. You just sign stuff, and it was just kind of that same mindset.
Mm-hmm. And also, you hinted at being protected. I think Robert told you that you have higher beings. And did you ever, were you assisted or were you offered insights from any of these guides?
I mean, sometimes I think I do. I second guess myself. I remember being like in the program and talking to the navigator, and the first time I really got strong with telepathy with him. That was one of the first things he said to me is like, I said, how do I know this isn't just a voice in my head and this isn't you, and this is you? Like, how do I know the difference? And he said, it's me. He said, stop second guessing yourself. Just go with your first instincts. And so like I have, I believe have talked. It's not something at a constant. It doesn't happen all the time. I'm really not a channeler. I don't claim to be. And there are times where I can sense Robert, you know what I mean? Him going down my timeline and things like that. Being in the hospital with my mother and seeing that Paul Rubin died, I felt his presence like at that moment in time. Like I knew he was there. I knew he was watching the TV at the same time I was watching the TV. I could feel this. Like I was 100%, I could feel that. But I mean, yeah, I feel Robert told me I'm under protection. Yeah, and I just had to go through a learning experience, and that's all this was. This whole like having a connection to this reptile and things like that. They also themselves they said that they weren't expecting me to poke the reptile in the eye the way I did when I joined the program. That was a variable they weren't ready for. So that was something else they had to work out. Something I did, something they weren't expecting. Even though they could see into the future, there are variables that they don't sometimes see.
And that was the whole reason why you got tortured in the first place.
That was the whole reason, yeah. For one of us to actually touch one of them and that kind, to jam one of them in the eyeball, yeah, that was considered, punishable by, death through torture as far as they were concerned.
Mm-hmm. And did Robert offer any more insight about you being a splice of Lyran and Reptilian? I'm guessing that it's not just something that, you know, you fumbled on, but have attained through thousands of years of evolving your physical DNA on other planets.
Well, he said it was like because, the Lyrans and the Reptilians, that was one of the first beings the Reptilians encountered and waged war on. And I guess the war was at a stalemate for so long, he said, that they tried to reach an agreement where they did create like these spliced souls as like a way of a means of peace is pretty much what it was. And yeah, it was just the splicing of the reptilian and the Lyran DNA, which is what he explained to me, which is what my consciousness is. And that was just basically like a way to kind of attain peace between two warring factions because the war had lasted so long and neither side was budging. And Robert explained to me that that's what it was for. It was almost like a way to like gain peace through two opposing forces. Was to create not. He said there weren't many, but they're out there like spliced consciousness, spliced souls, and usually it happens because of that reason. And usually it's a reptile and something else because the reptiles attack everything, everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard that there's only very few planets, Earth included, that volunteered to merge as an experiment these two perspectives because they are the two predominant perspectives in this galaxy, and that it's if we manage to do it, it will have beneficial ripple effects in throughout the galaxy. So yeah, nearing the end, but was going to maybe shoot some questions about so you never actually saw the looking glass, but you just heard from secondhand, right? You never saw it in operation.
Robert said I did.
Okay.
He said you saw the looking glass, and it's all very similar. Portals, looking glass. He kind of like acted like it was the same, all kind of like the same technology with different names. Whether it's a Stargate, a looking glass. You could turn a Stargate into a looking glass if you just put the headset on, and then you could see through the Stargate.
All right.
It's just different names, but basically the same technology. Remember there was a ramp going of it, a metal ramp. There was a smart glass pad kind of like attached to an arm, a stationary arm that you would kind of put in where you wanted to go, what time period, things like that, right off to the side, and then the portal would appear. And yeah, I believe it was just like white shimmering liquid, it looked like. And when you step through it, it just became like a tunnel with a light at the end, and then all of a sudden you were on the other side and you were there. And that's kind of how it looked.
So you maneuvered it yourself. I heard that it requires a psychic technician to do it, to establish a telepathic link with it.
Oh, I mean, most of this tech is, yeah. I mean, all ET tech pretty much is a telepathic link. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what is the accuracy rate or the batting average of the looking glass predictions that Robert has made in 2005 so far? What would you estimate the range?
I mean, well, what he told me was it was 94% accurate, 4% other
4%, yeah.
outcome, and 2% variable is how he explained it to me. But I mean, as far as what I'm seeing right now with, what I'm just really looking at right now, well, Trump became president, but what's happening right now is they're on California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Those borders, there's a demilitarized zone right now, and that only happens like before conflict. Like there's like a military kind of border, artificial border where it's just armed to the teeth with military personnel and vehicles. And that they say it's to stop immigrants from coming in from Mexico, but that seems like that's a lot of money, to feed, to entertain, you know what I mean? Like set up tents, pool tables, shower tents, toilets, computers, everything else. All these people, they have a life and there's a lot of military right now on the border of those three states of Mexico. And that seems to be turning into something that it seems like it may be an invasion of Mexico. And he's already said that he's declared war on the cartels. And a lot of people don't understand this, but the cartels own Mexico. So if you're saying you're waging a war on the cartels, you're basically saying that we're ready for war with Mexico, and that feels like that's going to happen relatively soon, in my opinion.
Right. So you think it's the baby steps of that war that he presaged that it was going to end up in a decided Mexico loss. But
Yeah, he said they lose, yeah, 1/3 of their population. He said it takes like 4 or 5 years, I believe he said. And yeah, he said we push them down to like the town of Quetzalcoatl near the where it bottlenecks near the Yucatan
Tehuacan.
Peninsula.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But but I lost count of the amount of ridiculously accurate and impossible to fabricate predictions that he made, like with Miles Morales and South Park and other things that. But how did you react, or did they become so commonplace that you're not even surprised anymore?
I wasn't even surprised. And it was always just something in the back of my mind as it was happening and things like that. I had a life and I wasn't really committing myself to it, to what I'm doing right now. I couldn't just think about things like that constantly. And when I saw the South Park one, that one was like, boom, like that was it. Yeah. But like the Spider-Man and stuff like that, I mean, I don't really keep up with comics. I haven't since like middle school. But that was like, huh, like yeah, that was strange. That was kind of like that. But yeah, when I saw the South Park like adrenochrome episode, that was like, wow, yeah, yeah.
And there isn't one that should have come to fruition but didn't. So basically, they all are either in a state where they already happened or are like in the early stages of.
Early stages and like how he explained it to me is it can be prolonged, but it can't be stopped. That was something else he said. He said no matter how many scenarios we run through looking glass technology, this is going to happen. And as far as what he said the Satanists that stopped looking at their looking glass because they're in denial. Like they came up with the same predictions with their looking glass technology as we did. And they just refused, they just turned off their machines and they refused to look at it anymore because it's just going to go on as mission is planned. They're not going to stop until, they win or they're all dead. And it seems like they're just gonna lose and die.
So maybe last question. Do you imagine that the so-called Satanists or people who are, furthering the agendas of the fallen angelics are going to have to be ousted, or will there be a way to, converge the two and keep both parties, thriving?
They will be ousted, and then some of them who will, some of them who turned enough evidence on their friends, lower levels, they'll be spared, but he said that they'll be watched. Like, we'll be watching them. Like, I remember, like, they said that they're going to allow, Chelsea Clinton. He said that they're going to allow Chelsea Clinton to live. And I said, well, won't that just create like pockets of resistance, And he said, no, we have ways of watching them. We have ways of keeping an eye. Like, she won't be able to leave our site, is kind of like how he said it, whether it's through the 5G tech or the other tech they have. And as far as this balance, you don't need like an absolute balance, but one can't exist without the other. So you're always going to have there's no such thing as a utopia, and he told me that. Like, on any world, there's no such thing as a utopia. There's peaceful beings, but every now and again, somebody's going to act out and do something they shouldn't. And that's just like the way it is. You need a positive and a negative. It's just the way it is. Right now, we're just way off kilter as far as the Satanists have all the control, but we're going to try to get it, where the Anglo-Saxon has more control, more of a positive.
Right. So it's not like you can change the duality. That's going to stick to this planet as long as it exists, but you can even it out.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And the deep state will finally get some sort of amnesty from what you're saying.
Well, he says it's what the people will demand. He says that they want the people to be so fed up, which I think people are getting right now, that they don't have to push it upon them. They want them to be ready. He told me about DNA memory, and that's what the whole thing with the COVID and everything like that, people dying from these shots. They want people to be kind of like almost on the verge of like a riot. To be like so angry and so upset that they know the people are ready for it. That's basically what he said. And yeah, like certain perpetrators, like he told me Hillary Clinton, if they don't show her execution publicly after the people find out what she did to that little girl, like there would be riots. Like people would get extremely upset if they weren't allowed to see her execution. And he said it's not going to be like that in the United States. He's like, the world is going to demand to see her die, like pretty much, and that's the way it's going to be. And yeah, I mean, they're going to get what's coming, and it's just boom, boom, boom. We're very quickly. And something he also said to me that I said in a past interview for the first time was, and this was before Easter. I remember him saying after Easter. I remember him saying that, like when things really start to pick up. And the day after Easter is when the Pope died. So the last Pope died, and things seem to be picking up now. So I think we're getting to a point where the people are ready, and it may take, a couple more years for everything to flood out. They're not just going to let it all at once, but I would say like in the next 2 or 3 years, big things are going to start happening.
Mm. Hopefully, it's not going to be just another Illuminati reset like the flood from 5,000 years ago or the Atlantean cataclysm, but it's going to be the one that it's, the dawn of a new age, 1,000 years of peace and so on.
1,000 years of peace and beyond. Yeah, as he said, yes.
Cool. So, yeah, I want to thank you for sharing your excellent story, and it was eye-opening as always. And feel free to share any upcoming conventions that you're going to take part of.
Oh, I mean, I'll be at the St. Petersburg convention, disclosure now, and at St. Pete Beach in Florida. I'll be there. I'll be the guest of honor, is what they're calling me. So yeah, like I'll be there to talk to everybody and say hi, and yeah, I can't wait to meet you.
Awesome. Well, yeah, great job, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
All right, thanks, Daniel.